Hey guys, Station X here, and today we're going to be taking a look back at the Xbox One. This is part 2 in our discussion of the Xbox family of systems, but here in this episode, we're going to be taking a little bit of a look at Xbox's dark point in their history, just because the future of the Xbox brand was fairly uncertain around this time, and you'll see why I'll say that in a second. But seeing how there's 3 different models, it's going to kind of be separated into 3 different points, 3 different acts, easy to say, in the video. But without further ado, let's get started. So, starting this off, we're going to be talking about how the Xbox One was announced. Back in 2013, the Xbox One was very heavily rumored to be announced towards the later end of the year, and sure enough, along with the PS4, the Xbox One was officially announced with the name and everything. A lot of people thought Xbox One was a kind of stupid name. I wasn't a big fan of it at first either. You know, of course, over time you kind of had to get used to it, but the Xbox One here was the whole point of the naming convention and all of it was supposed to be the all-in-one entertainment center that you didn't need anything else in the living room. It was just this thing right here. It was a video game console. It was a multimedia center, essentially. It had things like Netflix and such, like for all your streaming services. So it's a streaming box. It plays movies. So you could put DVDs, Blu-rays, etc. in this and just watch your movies that way. It really much wanted to try and capitalize on that, people who don't play games but could still buy an Xbox One, essentially. That's the mindset they were going for. Unfortunately, the very big execution of this thing was so disastrous that it would lead into the fact that it kind of caused doom for the Xbox One right away. What are those mistakes that they did? Well, let me tell you this. For one, they wanted to, when they announced this thing, all they did was talk about the multimedia features. Nothing about whether or not this thing, playing games or anything like that, because God forbid they reference this as a video game system. But they talked about all the other things, the fact that you could put cable on this and watch your cable TV through this, because there's a second HDMI for that. The fact that you could put all your streaming services on here and never have to use anything else. The fact that you could play movies, you could use Skype, you could do all these other things, like all these social medias on there. But no one really cared. People who like video games and people who play video games didn't really care about all these things. They were just kind of nice to have, I guess, but they put too much of a focus on it. It was too much of, here's this, here's that, here's this, and nothing about actual video games themselves. It was just kind of like video games was an afterthought. And so a lot of people who really enjoyed video games, or just the hardcore gamers themselves, just felt alienated, because they were just kind of trying to get for that, elusive PS2 status where people would buy a PS2 just for the DVD player and not even care about the games, which ultimately helped it become the #1 most selling console of all time. While this thing had its goods, the goods were very and far between, considering the fact they didn't even say anything about that. As a video game machine, I think it's okay and it does the job, but they never really highlighted what the Xbox One can really do when it comes to games when they first announced it. So, other than just showing, hey, we got a new Halo coming out, hey, we got a new Gears coming out, I mean, that was kind of expected. But, the announcement was just disastrous. Second thing is that you always had to be online with this system. Now, that's something that they announced that was a requirement for this system. Now, I don't remember if, this or any of the other problems I'm going to mention to you were still really a thing other than the Kinect. I know that was still a problem at launch, because a lot of the things that people said boo about this system did not make it to launch. I never actually bought the Xbox One when it first launched in 2013. I was still sticking to my 360 just because of some of these problems. But I didn't get one until 2015. But this being always online was kind of an issue. So if you lived in an area that had really bad internet or just couldn't get internet, then you were kind of screwed out of it. Now, what was the solution to this problem that they inevitably had? Their answer was just buy a 360, which is kind of a condescending thing to say to people. You know, if you can't use internet on our new system, just stick with the old one. What are you doing? That was kind of their attitude with it, and that kind of hurt them, in a sense, because people don't like that when they have a concern about your new system, and you want to buy it, but this thing that they're going with isn't going to help you in any way, and they just tell you to take a hike. What does that say? So having it being always online, even for things that even for games that don't have online features or just single player only, is kind of ridiculous. So that was another issue with it, but it's not nearly as problematic as this next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the fact that number 3, they locked pre-owned games to an account. When you buy a game, this is how it works. When you buy a game from the store, GameStop, whatever, you pay your $60. You bring it home, you put it in the system, and you download it. It's tied to your account. So now, if you had a friend or a family member who wanted to play it, wanted to try it out for a little bit, or say whether it be on the same Xbox on their own account, or just letting them take it home to put it in their Xbox, they would have to pay an additional fee just to unlock it. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So I don't know why they thought that was a really good idea to do, but it would essentially have killed pre-owned games, because that was just pre-owned games was never going to be an option at that point. And 2, it just kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a physical copy. The biggest pro to owning physical games is that you could do whatever you want with it. If you want to sell it or give it to somebody or let someone borrow it, you can do that. It's not like with digital, where digital's tied to your account. That's it. And you can't really do anything other than just playing the game and just having a commitment to it. That's it. Physical had those advantages, but by doing that, it took those advantages away. It'd be no different than just buying it digitally. And maybe the thought was, maybe people would just go to digital at that point, and it wouldn't be a big deal. But of course, people got very upset with that. That's one of the features I know for a fact did not make it to the launch. Whether the online only thing was still a thing, I don't know, but that tying to the account thing, where it made physical games practically useless, was just such a stupid idea. And I don't know who in their right mind thought that, yes, let's do that for the Xbox. It just doesn't make any sense. But the other big problem was its price point, because they wanted to bundle it in with an attachment called the Kinect. Now, everyone I'm sure knows about the Kinect. If you're a person who follows Xbox, Kinect was around during the 360 towards the later end of it, and it was okay. People didn't have too much of a gripe with it, other than I guess it being pushed a little too hard towards the end. It was essentially Xbox's answer for grabbing those people who bought Wii's and things like that over there, again, capturing casual fans. And so when they did that, they made a new Kinect for the Xbox One, and they decide, you know what, we're gonna make it just, you have to use it. And so it was bundled in with every system, and therefore making it more expensive. They didn't make it so that, you had the option to not have to buy it or just buy it separately. No. Instead of this being a $400 system, this was a $500 system, all because of a crappy webcam that people didn't want to buy, or at least be forced to buy. Not to mention that people were talking about how the thing would, spy on you and, be on while the system's off, and just, having things like the government spying on you with it. Whether or not that was actually true, probably not, but you don't want to have a reputation with your camera like that if this thing is going to be forced to use on your system. Because that whole thing was, the advertisements was like, oh, you could use it to turn the Xbox on, like how back on the 360, but it was just more integral, you know. It also was able to sign in that way, kind of the same way like how on the new iPhones they have Face ID. It was similar to that. So, but just people were just not ready for that kind of thing, I feel like. You know, it was just kind of like, ooh, I don't want people spying on me sort of thing. It's just this giant bulky camera that didn't look nice either. But yeah, I mean, it did have some good gaming experiences, but just kind of like, oof. Those problems right there is what really hurt this system. And it kind of gave this system a really uphill battle when it comes to getting people to buy it. I mean, with that one issue of locking games, it was so bad that Sony made a video clowning on the Xbox by just simply making it a tutorial on how to share games on the PlayStation. So, with that being the most disastrous thing of all time, in fact, like, none of the people who were there for the announcement of this thing are either they're not working for Microsoft anymore, or they're just relocated to a different division or something. You know, that's saying something, okay? So, with this, and also just how the way it looks, it's just not the most attractive looking system. Now, what the next part we're going to be talking about is the next model they tried to release, because after this, the future of Xbox was very uncertain. If you notice that there was no exclusives like the PS4, this system and its announcement and launch was kind of the reason for that, and will be discussed a little bit more in Act 2. So going into Act 2 now, talking about the Xbox One S, what kind of led up to this being a thing was kind of a miracle, actually, because at this point, with the disastrous launch, Microsoft was very much debating on whether or not to even keep this thing around. The Xbox One could have very well have been the last console they ever done, and because of the fact that people did not like the Xbox One. It was just such a disaster. But there were those in Microsoft that still felt very confident that the Xbox brand can move forward past this. And one of those individuals was Phil Spencer. Thankfully, he saw that, like, hey, this thing still has potential. We just got to get rid of all the negative stuff about it. And so a lot of those things that I mentioned didn't really last very long, especially after this model was announced. Now, you could still do that, like, whole cable thing, because it has 2 HDMI still. In fact, every Xbox One still has that, but it was never really heavily advertised. When this came out, they were really heavily focusing on games, and that was just kind of the most important thing they should have done in the first place. I mean, if you compare it to the 360, it was almost like they completely went the opposite direction when it came to their advertisement for the original model. But here they kind of roped it back. And so with this being a lot sleeker, smaller, could actually fit in places compared to the Xbox One, doesn't overheat as much, doesn't have as many issues when it comes to gaming and stuff, didn't have the always online, didn't obviously have that tie to an account thing. It was pretty much how the Xbox One should have launched, but we ended up getting this instead. I find it funny that Xbox, both with the 360 and the Xbox One, has a history of, correcting mistakes on their second try compared to just getting it a home run in their first try, which I think is, very interesting. With this, what you could do is you could play movies in 4K with this, not games, but you could play movies in 4K with this. But again, it's not something they heavily advertised. So, I mean, that fact kind of gets a little lost when it comes to the Xbox One S. But this is the one that most Xbox owners have, if not the other model. But I barely know anybody who still owns that original one. But yeah, this one was a lot nicer. A lot more people bought Xbox Ones during this time. And they were trying to play kind of catch up with the PS4 with this. And they did have some exclusive games here and there, but to compare the exclusives to Sony, I mean, like, for Xbox, you had Sea of Thieves, which is okay. You had Sunset Overdrive, which was like, who talks about Sunset Overdrive? Crackdown 3, which I know Crackdown itself was a good game, but the third one, while it was announced along with the Xbox One back in 2013-14, which I thought was hilarious, but didn't come out until pretty much the last year of its existence. You had exclusive games like that, other than just Halo, Gears, and Forza, and compare that to PlayStation. You had Uncharted, God of War, Persona, which isn't even an official, technically an official exclusive. The only reason why it's exclusive is because they never just put it on anything else. You had Spider-Man. You had The Last of Us. You had so many really good titles for that thing that were exclusive, comparing it to that. And not to mention Gran Turismo being the, just the PlayStation equivalent to Forza. So, I mean, really, the only reason why you would buy an Xbox is just for Halo and Gears at this point. But, the future was still kind of bright for this. At least with this model, they could go somewhere with it. So we're going to be going on to the next act, which is Act 3, the Xbox One X. So going into this act, the Xbox One was trying to play catch up. And so with PlayStation announcing they were making a PS4 Pro, Microsoft wanted to do a kind of pro version of the Xbox as well, which I thought this was kind of an unprecedented thing, because never before has a console generation introduced a sort of upgraded version of their system. Normally what would happen is you would have a system out, and you might maybe every now and then redesign it to make it smaller, maybe once or even twice, and then you would move on to just make a new console. It's not like with PCs, or if you bought a PC, you don't just buy a whole new PC to get the latest and greatest hardware. You could just swap the parts out. Here you couldn't do that. You had to just make a whole new system if it wanted to be more powerful. But they decided to just kind of keep, with PlayStation and Xbox, they kept the whole, we're going to keep the branding, but we're going to make this just slightly more powerful. Like with PlayStation, they took the PS4 and just made it slightly more powerful than the original model and just called it Pro. So with this, that was the same thing. In fact, their whole tagline for the Xbox One X, or Project Scorpio during this time, was the fact that this was the most powerful video game system to date, or at least at the time. So this was going to be a big powerhouse thing. Ultimately, I just think it just makes the games look just a tiny bit nicer. Although I gotta say, something I didn't mention with the special editions, because as you noticed, I have special editions for all three models. The special editions got nicer and nicer. Microsoft's always had nice special editions, but the One S had laser etching in it, and this one not only has that, but you could, I don't know if you could see it, but there's translucent stuff here. This is supposed to look like an ice brick, which I think is really nice looking. It's supposed to be you see it through the ice. I just think that's cool. But regardless, this thing was actually pretty decently powerful, and it could play games in 4K for once. Not true 4K, but it pretty much got the job done. So these half steps kind of helped prolong the generation a bit, making the generation a lot longer, and sure, we're going to see that more in the future with the Series X and PS5. But during this time also, they introduced something called the Xbox Game Pass, which is still active today. But essentially, that was kind of their saving grace. Xbox, no matter what they did, they could have presented it as a 24-karat gold console. And people would have thought this was like those pirate coins you get in Halloween, okay? So they could have done whatever, and people would have still had such a negative reception to this thing. The PS4 outsold Xbox One, all the models combined, by a landslide. And so this had the two systems after the original model really had an uphill battle to fight, but fight they did, and with Game Pass it just made it that much easier, and it kind of helped Microsoft earn money through the Xbox brand without having to rely so much on the console, people buying that and buying the games that way. You can use Game Pass on a computer, on a phone, on a tablet, whatever, and easily buy games through that as well. And now it comes with Xbox Live. So I mean, like, for me, if I didn't own pretty much every single Xbox Game Pass game on like physically, if I didn't own any of that physically, I would have thought it was a good deal. You know, I just don't think it's a good deal for me personally. But, you know, not to just advertise Xbox here, not sponsored by them, but, you know, it was just something that was really important because a lot of people actually really liked that deal, because essentially it's like Netflix. So it was an easy way for people to finally just, you know, play games and not have to worry about taking up a lot of space or having a commitment to buying this when people hear such negative things about it. It kind of almost opens the door for you in a way. So if you were thinking about buying an Xbox but wasn't too sure about it, you could try their games on like a tablet or phone or whatever, or maybe on your computer even. And if, say, you wanted to just buy an Xbox just for the hell of it, and then have the ability to play DVDs and movies on there, use the Netflixes and stuff like that, you could do that. So I mean, it's kind of a nice, genius way of getting people interested in an Xbox. So I mean, this kind of set up the future of the Series X, and how the Series X, you know, could have easily just not done as good, but it's actually doing pretty decently well, especially comparing it to the PS5. It's not a landslide victory like PS4 was to the Xbox. They're pretty close to each other. Now, while people still have that perception of PlayStation is better, you know, Microsoft's coming out of the gate. Like I said in the last video, they are trying to ramp up, you know, having console exclusives again and stuff like that, kind of harkening back to the 360 and original Xbox time. Xbox One essentially was this. They tried to do something really nice and neat with the Xbox One, but ultimately failing due to very stupid and dumb decisions, and them kind of going through a depressed, giving up, you know, phase for a few minutes. But Phil Spencer and others in the Xbox office, or just in Microsoft in general, had faith that the Xbox could last longer than the Xbox One. And so them pushing ahead and trying to dig it out of the trench and pushing it forward, I think is awesome. Because while I love Xbox, I didn't want to see it go out the way it did, and, you know, kind of going into the next Sega. It's always a sad thing to see. So that'll pretty much conclude the discussion of the Xbox One. But let me know what you guys think of the Xbox One. Did you have fond memories of it? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you thought it was stupid when it first came out? Or did you think it was great later on? Let me know what you guys think. It's been Station X, and hope you have a good day.